Before Coca-Cola became a global symbol, it was a syrup poured across a pharmacy counter in Atlanta. Before it made fortunes, it belonged to a man whose own life was falling apart. John Stith Pemberton had survived war, but he could not escape the addiction that followed him home. By the time he died in 1888, the drink he created had not made him wealthy. It had barely begun its life. Then another pharmacist stepped in. Asa Griggs Candler saw not a medicine, but a machine for building an empire. He bought control cheaply. He expanded relentlessly. He made Coca-Cola famous. His heirs inherited the crown, then sold it for a price that stunned the country. Decades later, that decision would look less like genius and more like one of the most expensive exits in business history. Because the family that came next did not just keep Coca-Cola, they turned it into a worldwide empire. And the Candlers were left with mansions, gossip, tragedy, and the ghost of what they once owned. This is the story of how Coca-Cola passed from a wounded inventor to an ambitious builder, then from one dynasty to another. It is a story about vision, timing, inheritance, and the brutal cost of letting go too soon. To understand how all of that happened, you have to start with the man who created the drink and never lived long enough to see what it would become. Chapter 1. The Wounded Man's Recipe. It begins, fittingly, with pain. In April 1865, as the American Civil War was collapsing into its final days, Union cavalry under General James Wilson stormed Columbus, Georgia. The war was already effectively over. Lee had surrendered. The Confederacy was falling apart. But men still fought, and among them was a pharmacist named John Stith Pemberton, serving as a lieutenant colonel in the 3rd Georgia Cavalry Battalion. During the assault, a saber tore across his chest. He survived the wound. What he did not escape was everything that came after. To control the pain, doctors gave him morphine. What began as treatment became dependence, and that dependence would shape the rest of his life. Before the war, Pemberton had been a respected and successful pharmacist. Born in 1,831 inches, Knoxville, Georgia, he earned his pharmacy license young and built a strong practice in Columbus. He was trained, ambitious, and technically gifted. His laboratory was known as one of the finest in the South. He had a wife, Anne Eliza Clifford Lewis, and a son, Charles. From the outside, it looked like the life of a serious man with a serious future. Then the war cut through all of it. Afterward, like many Southerners, he tried to rebuild. He moved to Atlanta, a city still pulling itself out of the wreckage left by the March of War. He manufactured patent medicines and sold them across the region. But professionally, he was rebuilding while personally he was unraveling. Morphine was eating his health, his peace of mind, and his money. He was not just working as a pharmacist anymore. He was experimenting as a man trying to save himself. His search led him into stimulants and tonics, the kind of formulas that were common in the late 19th century. One of his most notable early creations was French wine coca, a drink made with red wine, coca leaf extract, and cola nut. It mixed alcohol, cocaine, and caffeine in a way that fit the age perfectly. He promoted it as a tonic for nerves, headaches, fatigue, and low spirits. In a different era, it might have remained a successful regional medicine, but history intervened again. In 1886, Atlanta and Fulton County passed temperance laws that made alcohol sales illegal. French wine coca instantly lost its place in the market. Pemberton had to change the formula or lose the product completely, so he went back to work. With the help of drugstore owner Willis Venable, he removed the wine and kept adjusting the mixture. What came out of those experiments was not exactly medicine anymore. It was a thick, dark syrup. Mixed with carbonated water at a pharmacy counter, it became something lighter, sweeter, and somehow more inviting than the remedies that surrounded it. Pemberton's bookkeeper, Frank Robinson, suggested the name, Coca-Cola. He believed 2 capital C letters would look good in advertising. He also wrote the now famous script logo by hand. On the 8th of May, 1886, the first glass of Coca-Cola was sold at Jacob's Pharmacy in downtown Atlanta for 5 cents. At first, the drink was not a sensation. Only about 9 servings sold on an average day. But Pemberton sensed something in it. He advertised it as delicious, refreshing, and invigorating. He reportedly believed it might someday become a national drink. The tragedy is that he was right. He just would not live long enough to prove it. By then, his body was failing badly. Cancer was spreading through his stomach. Morphine had long since dug itself into his life. He needed money. And when sick men need money, they do desperate things. Pemberton began selling pieces of his ownership to different partners around Atlanta. The deals overlapped. The records were messy. Control of the formula became tangled in confusion and urgency. Somewhere in that confusion, another pharmacist began to circle closer. His name was Asa Griggs Candler. Pemberton died on the 16th of August, 1888, at the age of 57. He was buried in Columbus. He left behind a widow with little, a son who inherited more of his weakness than his opportunity, and a product whose real life had barely begun. His son, Charles, tried to market his own version of the drink. It went nowhere. He died only a few years later, trapped by the same opiates that had consumed his father. That is one of the cruelest details in the whole story. The man who created one of the most famous products on Earth never saw its future. He built the spark. Then darkness took him before the fire ever spread. And while the inventor was being buried, another man was already looking at the formula and seeing not a cure, not a tonic, but a business. Chapter 2. The Pharmacist Who Bought an Empire. Asa Griggs Candler did not look like a visionary in the romantic sense. He did not have the tragic aura of an inventor. He did not come wrapped in myth. He looked like discipline. The story goes that he arrived in Atlanta in 1873 with just $1.75 in his pocket. He was young, hungry, and serious. A druggist named George J. Howard hired him on the day he arrived, and Candler reportedly worked until midnight without pay just to prove he was worth keeping. Whether every detail of that story is perfectly polished or not, it fits the kind of man he became. Within a few years, he had married Howard's daughter, Lucy Elizabeth Howard. Then he bought into a competing pharmacy. Then he owned it outright. Candler was a Methodist. He did not drink. He had no patience for laziness. He measured people by work ethic, not charm. He built a successful business selling patent medicines. But more importantly, he understood something many skilled pharmacists did not. Real wealth would not come from selling dozens of products to a few local customers. It would come from selling one product to everyone. When he first encountered Coca-Cola in the late 1880s, he noticed something critical. People liked it, not because they were sick, because they wanted it. That changed everything. Where Pemberton still belonged to a world of remedies, Candler saw refreshment. He saw repeat demand. He saw habit. He saw scale. Through a long series of murky transactions between 1888 and 1891, he acquired the rights to the formula, the name, and the business for a total of around $2,300. It was one of the greatest bargains in business history, though at the time it probably did not look that way. He was not buying a giant, he was buying possibility. Then he did what winners do. He simplified the message. He moved Coca-Cola away from being sold as a cure and toward being sold as pleasure. He did not want people to think of it only when they had a headache. He wanted them to think of it whenever they were thirsty. In 1892, he formally incorporated the Coca-Cola Company with capital of $1,000,000. Then he attacked the market with uncommon aggression. He used coupons for free glasses, sending them out in massive numbers. He shipped syrup to pharmacies that had never heard of the product. He bet that if people tried it once, they would come back. That instinct was correct. By 1895, Coca-Cola was being sold in every state and territory in the United States. Sales of syrup exploded during the decade. What had once moved only modestly from a soda fountain in Atlanta became a national business. Candler also made one of the most important mistakes in the story. In 1899, two lawyers from Chattanooga convinced him to let them bottle and distribute Coca-Cola across most of the country. He charged them $1 for the bottling rights because he did not think bottled drinks would matter much. It was a huge misjudgment. Within 2 decades, more than 1,000 bottling plants were operating nationwide. Coca-Cola would become not just a fountain drink, but a bottled habit that could travel anywhere. And yet even that mistake could not slow him down. As money poured in, Candler began reshaping Atlanta itself. He built the Candler Building on Peachtree Street in 1906, a marble tower that became the city's tallest structure and its first steel skyscraper. He helped develop Druid Hills. He funded roads and water lines. In 1914, he pledged $1 million and 75 acres to move Emory College to Atlanta, helping create modern Emory University. His lifetime gifts to the institution reached roughly $8 million. Then in 1916, he entered politics and became mayor of Atlanta, handing operational control of Coca-Cola to his 5 children. That decision would become one of the turning points in the entire family story. Because Asa Candler understood how to build, his children understood how to inherit, and those are not the same skill. The timing was especially cruel. In 1917, a massive fire tore through Atlanta and destroyed thousands of homes. The city struggled. Then, in early 1919, Candler's wife Lucy died of breast cancer after 41 years of marriage. He was grieving, he was aging, and the business he had spent decades building was now in the hands of children, living in a different emotional world from the one that made him. Within months, they made the decision that would define their legacy. They sold Coca-Cola, but before that sale, another development had quietly helped raise the company's value even higher. It was not a man. It was not a boardroom decision. It was a bottle. Chapter 3. The Bottle That Conquered America. By the mid-1910s, Coca-Cola was successful enough to attract imitators from every direction. That created a serious problem. Straight-sided bottles looked alike. Labels peeled off in ice water. Shopkeepers mixed stock together. Customers often could not tell which drink was real. A famous product was becoming easier to counterfeit than to recognize. So the Coca-Cola Bottling Association asked for something radical. A bottle that could be recognized by touch in the dark. A bottle so distinctive that even if it shattered, someone could still tell what it had been. At the Root Glass Company in Terre Haute, Indiana, designer Earl Dean went searching for visual inspiration. He looked for coca leaves and cola nuts. He found neither. Instead, he found an image of a cocoa pod in an encyclopedia. It had curves, it had ribs, it had a silhouette that stayed in the mind. Dean sketched a bottle around that shape. The first version was too wide for existing machinery, so it had to be narrowed before production. The patent went forward under the name of Alexander Samuelson, a root glass supervisor. What mattered was not the paperwork. It was the result. Beginning in 1917, the contour bottle spread across the country. It did more than hold Coca-Cola. It made the brand recognizable even without a label. That was a leap in value. Coca-Cola was no longer just a drink people liked. It was becoming an object people could identify instantly. And all of that happened just before the Candler heirs agreed to sell. Chapter 4. The $25 million Mistake. The Candler children did not spend years agonizing over the sale. That is what makes the story sting. It was a transaction that looked sensible in the moment. Their father had transferred control of the company to them in 1916 when he became mayor. Their mother was ill and then gone. The business, while hugely profitable, faced regulatory pressure and legal trouble over caffeine and labeling. For the heirs, risk was real. And then a syndicate, led by Ernest Woodruff, president of the Trust Company of Georgia, offered $25 million. In 1919, that was not just a lot of money. It was almost unimaginable money. The deal closed on the 5th of September, 1919. It was the largest financial transaction in the history of the American South at the time. The new owners quickly reorganized the company and took it public. 500,000 shares were offered at $40 each. Investors lined up. From the perspective of the heirs, they had won. They had turned inheritance into an enormous fortune. They were not fools. They were doing what many people would do. They were choosing certainty. But history is brutal to people who trade a growing machine for a pile of cash. Asa Candler accepted the sale with resignation. He reportedly said that once he had handed the business to his children, it was theirs to do with as they wished. He himself would not have sold, but he did not stop them. Maybe he believed they had made a hard-headed business decision. Maybe he needed to tell himself that. The record does not fully answer the question. What is clear is this. They sold the company before they understood how large it could become. They could not see Robert Woodruff yet. They could not see the global expansion ahead. They could not see what decades of compounding would do to the value of ownership. So they sold. And in the years that followed, much of that money hardened into something easier to admire than to grow. They built mansions. Chapter 5. The Mansion Arms Race. Along Briarcliff Road and the surrounding streets of Druid Hills, the Candler heirs turned cash into architecture. Between roughly 1,916 and 1,922, all 5 children built estates. The neighborhood their father had helped develop became their stage. Money went into land, facades, gardens, pipe organs, ballrooms, and scale. The family that had once owned a company now looked like a dynasty in stone. Charles Howard Candler, the eldest, built Cullenberg, later often rendered Callenwald, a vast Gothic Tudor estate designed by Henry Hornbostel. Its most famous feature was a custom Aeolian pipe organ built into the walls so music could travel through hidden chambers. Charles projected establishment power, and his house did too. Buddy Candler went in the opposite direction. His Briarcliff estate sprawled across 42 acres and pushed past grandeur into spectacle. There were pools, a golf course, a farm, huge entertaining spaces, and eventually a private zoo. If Charles built for dignity, Buddy built for attention. Their sister Lucy lived at Rainbow Terrace, elegant and refined, with a library that would later become the darkest room in the family story. Walter built Lowwater House among creek and waterfall. William built the more restrained Rest Haven. From the outside, it must have looked magnificent. From the inside, it marked a shift. The money was no longer inside the machine. It was standing on the lawn. That difference would matter more with every passing year. Nowhere would it become clearer than in the life of Buddy Candler. Chapter 6. Buddy's Zoo and the Fall of a Fortune. If one member of the Candler family felt born for headlines, it was Buddy. He had been unruly from early on. At Emory College, he skipped classes, smuggled a goat into the bell tower, and earned the yearbook title of class pugilist. He had charisma, appetite, energy, and almost no instinct for restraint. His father sent him to Los Angeles to open Coca-Cola operations on the West Coast. But Buddy spent too much of his time in pool halls and too little in disciplined management. Still, money covers many flaws for a while. Buddy became a local legend in Atlanta. He built the Briarcliff Hotel. He helped supervise construction connected to the airfield that would eventually become Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. He raced airplanes. He collected magic tricks from China and India. He hired a Filipino magician named Jose Cruz to live on the estate and perform at parties. In a gold leaf ballroom on the top floor of his mansion, he hosted gatherings where magicians and Atlanta society mingled under chandeliers and applause. He turned wealth into theater. Then, in the early 1930s, he bought a zoo. Even by the standards of the rich, this was excessive. Animals were trucked into Druid Hills and paraded through quiet residential streets. Neighbors watched exotic creatures arrive at a private estate as though a circus had mistaken itself for a family home. The collection reportedly included a Bengal tiger, lions, a black leopard, a gorilla, baboons, and several elephants with names tied playfully to Coca-Cola language. Buddy charged admission and opened parts of the grounds to the public. It was outrageous. It was memorable. It was exactly the kind of thing people talk about when they believe money can absorb all consequences. For a while, maybe it could. Then reality entered through the most absurd door possible. A baboon escaped. It attacked a woman. It tore into her purse and devoured $60 in cash. She sued. She won $1,000. The zoo became a symbol of excess collapsing under its own foolishness. Buddy's finances were already weakening. The case did not create his downfall, but it exposed the fragility underneath the pageant. He closed the menagerie and donated the animals to Grant Park Zoo, the institution that would eventually become Zoo Atlanta. The drinking never stopped. That is another recurring rhythm in this story. Not every tragedy arrives dramatically. Some arrive by repetition. One glass, then another, then a life organized around numbing itself. Buddy sold Briarcliff in 1948 and spent his final years in the penthouse of his own hotel. He died on the 11th of January 1953. The mansion he left behind became Georgia's first alcohol treatment facility later that same year. The irony speaks for itself. The man who could not stop drinking built the house where others would later try to stop. But the saddest decline of all may still have belonged not to Buddy, but to the father who built everything in the first place. Chapter 7. The Patriarch's Disgrace. For most of his adult life, Asa Candler had looked like solidity. He had one wife. He had one mission. He worked, built, donated, expanded, and disciplined himself into legend. Lucy Elizabeth Howard Candler was beside him for decades, while he built Coca-Cola and helped reshape Atlanta. When she died in early 1919, something inside him broke. He was 67 years old. Within months, his children sold the company he had spent decades creating. He did not stop them. He may not even have had the emotional strength to fight. Then his life changed in ways that would have seemed impossible to those who knew the old Asa Candler. First came a much younger socialite from New Orleans, Onezima de Bouchel. They became engaged. The family intervened and pressured him to break it off. He did. She sued him for breach of promise. The newspapers loved it. Across the South, the image of the disciplined Methodist empire builder began to crack in public. The suit failed. The damage did not. Then, in June 1923, he married May Little Reagan, a widowed stenographer from his office building. She was 35. He was 71. She had twin daughters. The match shocked people. Within months, scandal followed again when May was arrested for drinking at a questionable establishment. Asa filed for divorce in 1924. Then, in one of those strange reversals history often leaves unexplained, he withdrew the suit before the year ended and let her return. Meanwhile, he kept giving away money. His philanthropy toward Emery continued. The man who had once controlled so much now seemed to be shedding it, either from conviction, fatigue, or a need to place purpose somewhere after losing the company that had defined him. Then, in 1926, he suffered a stroke. From there, his world narrowed sharply. He moved in and out of Wesley Memorial Hospital. The energy that had once remade Atlanta was gone. His fortune was largely diminished. His children were scattered across Druid Hills in houses that represented his money but not his values. Asa Griggs Candler died on the 12th of March, 1929, at age 77. He had arrived in Atlanta with almost nothing. He had turned a pharmacy drink into a national corporation. He had built skyscrapers. He had helped build a university. He had served as mayor, and he ended his life weak, scandal-marked, and unable to care for himself. He had done the hardest part. He had built the thing. Then he lived just long enough to watch it pass into another era. He was buried at Westview Cemetery. Not far away, eventually, Robert Woodruff would be buried too. The man who built Coca-Cola and the man who made it immortal would rest in the same ground. But before Woodruff's long triumph, the Candler story had one more dark chapter to play out inside a house called Rainbow Terrace. Chapter 8: Murder at Rainbow Terrace. By the early 1940s, the Candler fortune had already begun to look less like a victorious dynasty and more like a family preserving appearances while time worked against it. At Rainbow Terrace, Lucy Candler Hines and her husband Henry Hines were living in elegance touched by unease. Money was still around. Status was still around. But something more ordinary had begun to disturb the household. Someone was stealing from them. Small amounts of cash kept disappearing. Drawers left unlocked at night were not untouched by morning. Money vanished from Lucy's purse. The thefts were not massive, but they were intimate, and that made them more unsettling. It meant someone was entering the house, studying it, and leaving behind the feeling of violation. Henry Hines was not a man inclined to ignore such things. He was vice president of Citizens and Southern Bank, a civic leader, a founder of the Atlanta Boys Club, a force behind Scottish Rite Hospital, and a major figure in the Atlanta Athletic Club. He offered local officers a $100 reward to catch the thief. Two patrolmen, Marion Blackwell and Bill Miller, began watching the property at night. Henry himself sometimes stayed up to keep watch. Then came the night of the 28th of September, 1943. Across town, a railroad worker named Belloc was home recovering from surgery. Friends arrived and invited his wife away on a country drive. She took the children and left. Restless and alone, Belloc drove to Druid Hills. He had already broken into Rainbow Terrace before. Once, just weeks earlier, he had stolen $80 from Lucy's dressing room. He knew the layout of the house. That same night, Henry Hines was inside. He was 63 years old. When the intruder entered, Henry did not retreat and wait for police. He went after the man himself. What happened next has never felt fully settled. Lucy called the hospital and police around 10 that night. Early reports said Henry and another man had been wrestling with a burglar. When officers Blackwell and Miller arrived, they saw a figure crouching in bushes outside the house and opened fire. It was not the burglar. It was Dr. Bryant King Van, the couple's son-in-law, whose property connected to Rainbow Terrace by a dirt path. He survived. He said he had come to investigate the disturbance. Whether he fired first remained disputed. Henry Hines did not survive. He was found shot in the library, the same room where the family had entertained guests for years. Belloc later confessed and wrote out his version of events on a yellow sheet of paper. The family posted a reward. Lucy hired retired detective Raymond Ector to look for more answers. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, Atlanta never quite believed it had been fully explained. Rumors spread for years. Some whispered that a relative, not the intruder, had fired the fatal shot. The son-in-law in the bushes, the officers already familiar with the grounds, the confusion over who fired and when. Even descriptions of the intruder added haze rather than clarity. No version washed the room clean. Lucy could not bear to stay in the house. Eventually, she moved on, remarried, and lived until 1962. Rainbow Terrace passed into other hands and was later divided into condominiums. The library remained. A room built for polished conversation became a murder scene. Later, it became somebody else's living room. By the time this chapter closed, the Candlers no longer looked like custodians of a great fortune. They looked like a family whose money had outlived its power to protect them. And while their houses were absorbing scandal, another man was doing the opposite of everything they had done. He was not trying to look rich. He was trying to make Coca-Cola impossible to escape. Chapter 9. The Man Who Made Coca-Cola Global. Robert Woodruff was not impressed by the things that dazzled the Candlers. He had no interest in pipe organs, no fascination with private zoos, no appetite for decorative wealth. If the Candler heirs often seemed like people trying to look larger than life, Woodruff moved like a man interested only in scale that could be measured in markets. He was the son of Ernest Woodruff, the financier whose syndicate bought Coca-Cola from the Candler heirs in 1919. Robert himself had already bought shares. At first, that did not feel brilliant. By 1923, the stock had fallen badly, down to around $18 from the $40 offering price, and the company was under pressure. Woodruff was in New York, working in the automobile industry with White Motor Company, where he had risen rapidly. He had started from the bottom, shoveling sand in an Atlanta foundry at 19, then climbed because he knew how to sell. At White Motor, he was highly paid and moving fast. When 3 of his father's associates traveled north to persuade him to take over Coca-Cola, he accepted a salary lower than what he was already making. He later said he thought he might simply restore the stock to the price he had paid, sell it, break even, and return to cars and trucks. He never returned. What Woodruff brought to Coca-Cola was not romance. It was standards. He found syrup cheating at soda fountains. He found dirty bottling plants. He found half-washed bottles and uneven quality. That mattered because scale without consistency is fragile. If a Coca-Cola in one place tasted different from Coca-Cola somewhere else, then the brand would weaken every time it spread. So he rebuilt the company around discipline. He replaced the traditional sales department with a service department designed to help bottlers and distributors improve their operations. He emphasized training. He cleaned up production. He raised expectations. He launched campaigns built around memorable slogans, most famously, the pause that refreshes. But slogans were never the whole point. Woodruff's real ambition was much larger. He wanted Coca-Cola within arm's reach of desire. That phrase captures his genius. He did not merely want good distribution. He wanted nearness. He wanted the product available at the exact moment someone wanted it, anywhere. Under his direction, bottling spread across Latin America, Europe, and Asia. By the late 1930s, Coca-Cola was operating in 44 countries. The drink became more than a refreshment. It became a portable piece of American modernity, a symbol that could cross borders even where language could not. Woodruff understood that he was not just selling syrup. He was selling familiarity. He was selling a feeling. He was selling the idea that wherever you were, Coca-Cola could make the moment feel recognizable. He and his wife, Nell Hodgson, had no children. That matters symbolically. For the Candlers, wealth flowed into heirs who converted it into houses. For Woodruff, the company itself became the central legacy. He protected it accordingly. He officially stepped down as president in 1955 but never really let go. Through the board and the finance committee, he continued shaping the company for decades, choosing successors and guarding direction. He remained the most powerful figure in Coca-Cola history until his death in 1985 at age 95. Where the Candlers built a successful product and then sold it, Woodruff built an enduring brand and held on. And the moment that turned his vision into something much larger than national success came not in a quiet office, but in war. Chapter 10. 5 billion bottles. For most companies, war is chaos. For Robert Woodruff, World War II became the event that locked Coca-Cola into global history. In 1941, the United States entered the war, and sugar was rationed. For a company built on sweetness, this should have been disastrous. Instead, Woodruff made a decision so bold and so strategic that it changed everything. He declared that every American in uniform should be able to get a bottle of Coca-Cola for 5 cents wherever he was stationed, no matter what it cost the company. On the surface, it sounded patriotic, and it was. But it was also one of the most brilliant, long-game business decisions of the century. Because once Coca-Cola became tied to troop morale, it gained privileged status. The military treated it as essential. The company received relief from sugar rationing that would have strangled others. Then the infrastructure of war began carrying Coca-Cola into places the company might otherwise have taken decades to enter. In June 1943, General Dwight Eisenhower sent an urgent cable from Allied headquarters in North Africa, asking for portable bottling plants, millions of filled bottles, and enough equipment to keep producing more. Within months, a company engineer had flown to Algiers and opened the first plant. By the end of the war, 64 bottling operations had been established across Europe, North Africa, and the Pacific, as close to combat areas as possible. Coca-Cola sent 148 employees overseas to build and maintain those plants. They wore Army uniforms. They were given the rank of technical observer. Soldiers called them the Coca-Cola Colonels. That image alone tells you how unusual the moment was. A soft drink company had inserted itself into the emotional and logistical bloodstream of a global war. More than 5 billion bottles were consumed by American service personnel during the war. For soldiers in mud, hospitals, ships, and field camps, Coca-Cola was not just sugar and fizz. It was home in a bottle. It was familiarity delivered across oceans. It was a 5-cent reminder that somewhere beyond the smoke, the ordinary world still existed. But the long-term effect was not sentimental. It was structural. Everywhere those wartime plants operated, local populations encountered Coca-Cola. When the war ended, the plants did not simply vanish. They became civilian bottling operations. Infrastructure built for troops became a platform for peacetime expansion. Between the mid-1940s and 1960, the number of countries with Coca-Cola bottling nearly doubled. That is the moment when the Candler sale begins to look almost unbearably expensive. They sold before war itself helped turn Coca-Cola into something vastly larger. Even the Soviet sphere felt the drink's pull. Marshal Georgy Zhukov reportedly developed a taste for Coca-Cola after meeting Eisenhower and later requested a clear version that looked like vodka so it would attract less political attention. The company quietly made it. Think about how far the product had come. A wounded pharmacist in Atlanta once sold it from a pharmacy counter for 5 cents. Now generals, armies, and governments were making room for it. By the time Woodruff stepped back from daily management in the mid-1950s, Coca-Cola was no longer an American drink sold abroad. It was a global presence, a symbol, a habit, a machine. And while the company marched forward, the old Candler mansions remained in Atlanta like monuments to a different kind of wealth. Something impressive to photograph, tour, abandon, board up, and repurpose. Chapter 11. What remained? Today, Coca-Cola is one of the most recognized brands on Earth. Its products are sold in more than 200 countries. Billions of servings move through the world. The 5-cent fountain drink that John Stith Pemberton mixed in an Atlanta pharmacy became part of global daily life. The family that created it owns none of it. The Candler mansions survived in uneven ways, long enough to become symbols of what happens when wealth leaves the business that created it and settles into property, memory, and maintenance. Callenwald eventually passed through Emory University, a church, and DeKalb County before becoming the Callenwald Fine Arts Center in 1972. People now attend concerts, readings, and classes there. The organ still exists. The audience changed. Briarcliff suffered a harsher fate. After Buddy sold it, the estate became Georgia's first alcohol treatment center, later housed the Georgia Mental Health Institute, and eventually fell into vacancy and neglect. It still stands, but barely with the dignity it once projected. Lullwater House found a gentler second life as the residence of Emory's president. Rainbow Terrace was divided into condominiums. Asa Candler's own house became a church. William's house slipped quietly out of family hands. The kingdom scattered piece by piece. The financial detail is even harsher. None of the heirs kept meaningful ownership in Coca-Cola. They sold in 1919 and spent the following decades watching cash do what cash does when it is no longer attached to a compounding engine. Had even one original share been held across the century, it would have multiplied into thousands through splits alone. That contrast sharpens beside Robert Woodruff. He held on. He treated ownership as the center of the story, not the reward at the end of it. He gave away enormous sums in his lifetime. In 1979, his gift of 3 million Coca-Cola shares to Emory University, worth $105 million at the time, became the largest donation ever made to a single educational institution. He died in 1985 at 95, still holding stock he had bought more than 60 years earlier. Pemberton died broke. Candler died diminished. The children died scattered. Woodruff died old, powerful, and still attached to the stock. The drink outlived all of them. It outlived mansions, zoos, pipe organs, scandals, and grief. It outlived every person who thought they controlled it. Do not confuse a mansion with a machine. That may be the clearest lesson in the entire story. A wounded man invented it. A disciplined man scaled it. His heirs cashed out. Another steward held on. That is why the story endures. Not because of sugar or slogans, but because ownership, patience, and temperament decided who kept the future.